10 minutes after my son opened the letter from my insurance company, he was pounding on my front door hard enough to shake the glass. Not knocking. Pounding. The kind of pounding people do when panic finally outruns pride. I stood in my hallway holding a cup of chamomile tea, still wearing the navy travel jacket I'd bought for my first solo trip. At 67 years old. My first solo trip? Funny how some women can raise families, survive funerals, manage mortgages, and spend 40 years taking care of everybody else, yet still feel guilty booking one plane ticket for themselves. Daniel hit the door again. "Mom." I opened it slowly. Cold October air rushed into the house behind him. My son looked pale. Not angry, not confused. Scared. And strangely enough, that hurt more than the nursing home comment. Because fear meant the letter mattered. He stepped inside immediately, holding the envelope in one shaking hand. "What is this?" I glanced down at the insurance company logo, then back at him. "A letter," I answered calmly. "Mom." That tone. Adult children start using it once they believe they're the responsible one in the relationship. I walked toward the kitchen slowly. "Do you want coffee?" "Please stop acting like this isn't serious." I stopped beside the counter and looked at him carefully for the first time that evening. 42 years old. Thinning hair at the temples, still carrying stress in his shoulders the same way he did in high school football. Still my son. But no longer seeing me clearly. "You were already deciding where I belonged before I even retired," I said quietly. Daniel stared at me. "That's not fair." "Interesting. People say that when truth arrives before they're emotionally prepared for it." He dropped the letter onto the kitchen table. "I was trying to help you." There it was. The word that quietly ruins a lot of families. Help. Because sometimes help slowly becomes control wearing polite clothing. I pulled out a chair and sat down. Outside, wind moved dead leaves across the driveway under the porch light. Daniel remained standing. Nervous people hate sitting during difficult conversations. "What exactly did you think was going to happen to me?" I asked softly. He rubbed one hand across his face. "You're alone now." That sentence landed heavily between us. Alone. My husband Frank had been dead 3 years. Pancreatic cancer. 8 terrible months of hospital rooms, pill organizers, insurance forms, casseroles from church women, and watching the strongest man I ever knew slowly disappear in pieces. After Frank died, everybody started speaking to me differently. More gently. More cautiously. Like grief had transformed me from a person into fragile glass. At first I appreciated it. Then I started suffocating under it. Daniel finally sat across from me. "You've never traveled alone before." "No," I agreed. "You hate driving in unfamiliar places." "I dislike airport parking too. Doesn't mean my life is over." He looked away immediately. Another sign. People avoid eye contact when reality no longer matches the story they told themselves. I should probably explain how we got there. The retirement party happened 4 days earlier at the elementary school where I'd worked as secretary for almost 30 years. Streamers, sheet cake from Kroger, too many speeches. Teachers hugged me and promised we'd stay in touch, which adults say even when everybody knows life usually moves on quietly afterward. Still, I felt hopeful that afternoon. For the first time in decades, my life belonged partly to me again. No medication schedules, no school calendars, no caregiving routines. Just time. Beautiful, terrifying time. So 2 days later, I booked a small bus and rail tour through Charleston and Savannah. Nothing wild. No backpacking through Europe. Just historic hotels, coastal restaurants, guided tours, and finally seeing places Frank and I always postponed visiting because something else needed money first. I remember staring at the confirmation email, smiling like a teenager. Then Daniel came over for Sunday dinner. Melissa came too, carrying sweet potato casserole like she always did during fall. Their teenage daughter Chloe sat at my kitchen island doing homework while football played softly in the living room. Normal family evening. Until I mentioned the trip. Melissa smiled too quickly. "Oh," she said, "traveling alone." Not excitement, concern. That difference matters. Daniel asked practical questions. First dates, hotels, transportation. Then he saw the printed itinerary beside my purse. And something shifted in his expression. Not cruelty exactly. Calculation. "You spent how much?" I laughed softly. Retirement means I finally get to enjoy my own money a little. Melissa exchanged a quick glance with him. Tiny moment. Easy to miss. But older women survive by noticing tiny moments. Daniel leaned back in his chair. Mom, honestly, there's danger in that phrase, too. What usually follows honestly is something people already rehearsed privately. You should probably save that money for a nursing home someday. Silence swallowed the kitchen. Even Chloe stopped typing. Melissa immediately said, That's not what he meant. But it absolutely was what he meant. Because once adult children begin mentally placing parents into future categories, they stop seeing them as fully alive in the present. I remember nodding slowly. Not arguing. Not crying. Just suddenly understanding something painful. My son had already started preparing emotionally for my decline before I'd even started living again. That night after they left, I sat alone in my living room listening to the refrigerator hum in the quiet house. Then I called my insurance advisor the next morning. Not out of revenge. Out of clarity. And now, 4 days later, Daniel sat across from me holding that letter like it had shattered something fundamental inside him. Maybe it had. Good. Some illusions deserve to break early. The morning after Daniel showed up at my door with the insurance letter, I woke before sunrise out of pure habit. 40 years of caregiving trains your body to wake up early even after nobody needs anything anymore. I stood in my kitchen wearing socks and an old Ohio State sweatshirt while coffee brewed slowly beside the stove. Outside, the neighborhood still looked asleep. A newspaper lay damp at the edge of my driveway. 2 houses down, somebody's porch light flickered softly in the dark. Ordinary life. That's the strange thing about emotional earthquakes. The world keeps doing normal things while your heart quietly rearranges itself. Daniel hadn't called again after leaving my house the night before. Not that I expected him to. He looked shaken enough already. I still hadn't fully decided whether I felt angry or simply awake. There's a difference. Anger burns hot, awareness settles colder. I carried my coffee into the living room and looked around the house Frank and I bought in 1989. Same floral curtains, same dent in the hallway wall from when Daniel crashed his bike indoors during a thunderstorm at age 11. Same recliner where Frank spent his last weeks wrapped in blankets watching old westerns between morphine naps. People think widows eventually stop seeing ghosts in houses. We don't. We just learn how to walk beside them quietly. I sat down slowly and stared at the travel brochure still resting on the coffee table. Charleston, Savannah, historic inns, coastal train rides. The brochure suddenly looked almost ridiculous sitting there inside my practical little Ohio living room. Like something belonging to another woman. A freer one. That thought bothered me more than it should have. Because somewhere along the line I had stopped imagining myself as a person with future desires. I became wife, mother, caregiver, secretary, church volunteer. Useful things. Necessary things. But usefulness and identity aren't always the same thing. I thought about Daniel as a little boy. Feverish nights beside humidifiers, baseball uniforms washed at midnight, helping him study spelling words at the kitchen table while meatloaf baked in the oven. When Frank got laid off from the tire plant in the late 90s, I worked extra shifts at the school office to keep Daniel in community college. I never regretted any of it. Not once. But sacrifice becomes dangerous when families start treating it like your permanent personality instead of something you chose to give. That afternoon, my friend Joanne from church stopped by with pumpkin muffins. Church women can smell emotional trouble through walls. She set the container on my counter and studied my face carefully. What happened? I sighed. Do I really look that obvious? Yes. Fair enough. Joanne and I had known each other since our 20s. She survived a brutal divorce 15 years earlier and carried herself with the calm confidence of someone who already rebuilt her life once. I told her about the trip, the nursing home comment, the insurance letter, Daniel pounding on my door. Joanne listened quietly without interrupting. Then she asked, what scared him more, losing money or losing control? That question sat heavily in the room. Because deep down I already knew the answer. Daniel wasn't greedy. That would almost be simpler. No. He was frightened. Frightened of aging, of losing me, of responsibility, of uncertainty. But fear can still become disrespect when people stop listening and start deciding things for you instead of with you. Joanne broke off a piece of muffin thoughtfully. You know what happens to women our age? She asked. What? People slowly stop asking what we want. That sentence followed me all day, because it was true. After 60 conversations change subtly. Doctors talk to your children more. Salesmen call you young lady in fake cheerful voices. Family members begin discussing your future like you're a committee project instead of a living person. And the worst part. Sometimes women start participating in their own disappearance because it feels easier than fighting for space. That evening, Melissa called unexpectedly. Her voice sounded tense immediately. Daniel's upset. Interesting opening. Not how are you? Not can we talk? Just your son feels bad. I imagine he is, I answered calmly. Melissa exhaled. You know he loves you. I know. Then why would you do something like this without talking to him first? There it was. The assumption underneath everything. That I required permission. Not legally, emotionally. I walked slowly toward the window overlooking my backyard. Orange leaves covered the grass beneath the maple tree Frank planted when Daniel started kindergarten. I'm still allowed to make decisions about my own life, I said quietly. Melissa hesitated. That's not what I meant. Maybe not consciously. But emotionally it absolutely was. Melissa wasn't cruel either. That's what made the situation complicated. She genuinely believed she was being practical. Her own parents lived in assisted living outside Cincinnati after years of medical problems and financial chaos. To Melissa, planning early meant responsibility. But somewhere between concern and management, she stopped seeing me as a woman still capable of surprise. Before hanging up, she finally whispered, He's scared since your husband died. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was again. Everybody treating widowhood like the beginning of my disappearance instead of the continuation of my life. Later that night, I opened my laptop and searched something I hadn't admitted out loud to anyone yet. Solo travel groups for women over 60. Hundreds appeared. Photos of smiling gray-haired women standing beside oceans, mountains, historic towns. Women my age, traveling, laughing, living, not waiting quietly in recliners for younger relatives to organize their futures. I stared at those photos a long time. Then I booked an additional excursion through coastal South Carolina. Not because I felt brave. Because I suddenly realized bravery sometimes arrives after the decision, not before it. And for the first time in years, I wanted something that belonged only to me. Not my family, not my marriage, not my caregiving role. Mine. That realization felt terrifying. And strangely beautiful. 3 days after Daniel received the insurance letter, he came back to my house carrying grocery bags and guilt in equal amounts. That's another thing middle-aged sons do when they don't know how to apologize emotionally. They bring produce. I opened the front door and immediately spotted bananas, soup paper towels, half a pumpkin pie from Kroger. Very Midwestern peace offering. I didn't know if you needed anything, he said awkwardly. I needed respect, I answered before I could stop myself. Daniel flinched slightly. Good. Not because I wanted to hurt him. Because pain sometimes forces people to finally hear things they ignored while comfortable. He carried the groceries into the kitchen anyway. The October air smelled like rain through the screen door, and somewhere down the street somebody was mowing leaves into loud, uneven piles. Normal suburban sounds. I almost hated how ordinary the world stayed while families quietly cracked apart inside their kitchens. Daniel unpacked groceries carefully while avoiding eye contact. Finally, he said, You changed more than I expected. I leaned against the counter. Yes. Why? Interesting question. Not how could you? Not what were you thinking? Just why? Because deep down, Daniel already knew this wasn't about revenge. I realized something after retirement, I said quietly. Everybody started talking about my future like I wasn't in the room anymore. Daniel looked down immediately. Another sign. When Dad died, he began slowly everything changed. Yes, I agreed, for me. That landed harder than I intended. But it was true. People treated Frank's death like a family tragedy. Which it was. But widowhood itself belonged mostly to me. I was the one sleeping alone, eating alone, making medical decisions alone, learning how to survive silence inside a house built for 2 people. Daniel sat at the kitchen table heavily. I thought you needed help. There's that word again. He rubbed both hands together nervously. What was I supposed to think? You stopped working? You're alone. You've never traveled by yourself. You forget things sometimes. I stared at him. Everyone forgets things sometimes. You know what I mean. No. I did know what he meant. And that was the problem. Small signs of aging slowly become evidence in younger people's minds that your independence has an expiration date. I poured coffee into 2 mugs automatically. After 40 years of motherhood, your body still performs care before your emotions catch up. Daniel accepted the mug quietly. Mom, were you really going to remove me completely? I sat across from him slowly. Finally. The real question. No, I answered honestly. His shoulders loosened slightly. But I did change things. Daniel looked exhausted already. What exactly changed? I studied him for a long moment before answering. The truth mattered now. I changed my medical directives, I said calmly, and some beneficiary arrangements. He blinked. Why? Because you were already deciding what kind of life I should live without asking me what kind of life I still wanted. Silence settled heavily across the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed softly behind us. Outside rain finally began tapping against the windows. Daniel stared at the coffee cup between his hands. I wasn't trying to control you. No, I said gently. You were trying to manage your fear. That surprised him. Probably because he expected anger instead of understanding. But getting older teaches you something uncomfortable. Most family damage comes from fear, not evil. Fear of aging, fear of responsibility, fear of loss, fear of uncertainty. Melissa called while he was sitting there. Daniel answered immediately. No, I'm still here. Pause. Then no, she's calm. That sentence irritated me more than it should have. Calm women get underestimated constantly in American families. People assume emotional restraint means emotional weakness. Daniel listened for another moment before sighing heavily. No, Melissa, she didn't cut me off completely. Interesting wording. Like access to my life had become an entitlement instead of trust. After he hung up, I finally asked the question bothering me most. When did you start thinking about nursing homes? Daniel looked embarrassed instantly. A few months ago. Before or after my retirement? He hesitated too long. Before. That hurt quietly. Not dramatically. Just deeply. He explained quickly afterward articles about aging parents' concerns after I slipped on ice last winter, fear after hearing stories from coworkers about dementia and elder fraud. All reasonable things. That's what made it dangerous. Control often grows from reasonable concerns repeated too often. I wasn't planning to send you away somewhere, he whispered finally. Maybe not consciously. Daniel looked up sharply. What does that mean? I folded my hands carefully together. It means you stopped seeing me as a woman still building a life. You started seeing me as a future problem to solve. That sentence changed the room. I saw it happen physically. Daniel leaned back slowly like something inside him finally connected. Because for the first time, this wasn't about paperwork anymore. It was about dignity. The kind older people lose gradually through small assumptions long before anyone notices. Rain continued falling harder outside. Daniel's voice dropped lower. Do you really think I'd put you somewhere against your will? I looked at him carefully. My son. The boy I once rocked through nightmares. The man now terrified of becoming the villain in his own mother's story. And honestly, I didn't know the answer anymore. Not because Daniel was cruel. Because fear changes people quietly over time. So instead of answering directly, I asked him something else. When was the last time you asked what I actually wanted from my life now? Daniel opened his mouth, then stopped. And that silence answered everything. 2 weeks before my trip, I nearly canceled the whole thing over a bowl of potato soup. That's how ordinary major emotional decisions look at my age. Not dramatic storms, not screaming matches, just quiet surrender happening in kitchens while soup cools beside you. I was sitting alone at my dining room table watching steam rise from the bowl when my phone buzzed with a message from Melissa. Chloe's school concert is the same week as your trip. She'll be disappointed if you miss it. Simple message. Polite message. But underneath it sat the same emotional pressure that had followed me since retirement. Stay close, stay available, stay predictable. I stared at the phone a long time. Then I looked toward the folded travel itinerary sitting near the fruit basket. Charleston, Savannah, coastal train ride, historic inns. For weeks, those papers had represented freedom. Suddenly, they looked selfish. That's another thing women from my generation struggle with. Wanting something for ourselves immediately starts feeling like betrayal. I pushed the soup away untouched. The guilt arrived fast after that text. Not because Melissa directly asked me to cancel. Because mothers learn to hear disappointment before it's spoken aloud. By evening, I had almost convinced myself staying home would be the right thing. Then Joanne called. Again, church women smell emotional surrender from 3 counties away. You sound strange, she said immediately. I'm thinking maybe this trip is unnecessary. Long silence. Then, oh honey. Not judgment, recognition. I explained Chloe's concert family tension, Daniel still acting wounded, Melissa making little comments about timing. Joanne listened patiently. Then she asked, if this trip were for Daniel, would anyone ask him to cancel? That shut me up instantly. Because we both knew the answer. No. Men my age travel alone constantly without anybody treating it like emotional abandonment. Fishing trips, golf weekends, road trips with old military buddies. Nobody says. But what about the family? Women disappear into family expectations so gradually we sometimes mistake it for love. The next morning, Daniel stopped by unexpectedly. Again carrying groceries. Apparently guilt had fully transformed him into a part-time Instacart driver. This time, orange juice, bagels, a rotisserie chicken. He stood awkwardly in my kitchen while I put things away. You okay? He asked carefully. I almost laughed. Interesting how quickly children notice emotional shifts once they fear losing influence. I'm fine. You sure? No, I admitted quietly. That surprised him. Honesty changes family conversations fast. Daniel leaned against the counter. I know things have been tense. Tense isn't the word I'd use. He nodded slightly. Fair. After a moment he said, Melissa thinks maybe this trip is happening too soon. There it was. Not concern for me. Concern about disruption. I turned slowly toward him. Too soon for what? He hesitated. After retirement, after Dad, everything. I stared at my son carefully. 42 years old and still unconsciously believing grief should make people smaller instead of fuller. You know what, I think I said softly. What? I think everybody got comfortable with me putting my life second. Daniel looked genuinely hurt by that. Good. Not because I wanted revenge. Because emotional clarity often hurts before it heals. I never asked you to sacrifice your life, he said. No, I agreed. You just expected it. Silence filled the kitchen again. The clock above the stove ticked loudly while rain tapped against the windows. October in Ohio always sounds slightly lonely. Finally, Daniel sighed heavily. You've changed. Yes. I don't know how to talk to you anymore. That sentence almost broke my heart. Because beneath all the tension, he sounded scared. Little boys don't disappear completely inside middle-aged men. They just hide better. That afternoon, I drove to the church fellowship hall for a quilting fundraiser Joanne organized every fall. Long folding tables, crockpots plugged into extension cords, women discussing recipes and blood pressure medication. Very glamorous social life. But honestly, I needed those women. Because unlike family, they still treated me like a person becoming something, instead of slowly fading away. At one table sat Margaret Ellis, a 73-year-old widow who spent 6 months last year traveling through national parks in an RV by herself. Everybody in church called her brave. Margaret called herself finally awake. When I mentioned almost canceling my trip, she looked horrified. Evelyn, she said firmly, do not start disappearing before your body even asks you to. That sentence stayed with me all evening. Later, while helping clean up casserole trays and paper cups, Margaret told me something else. Loneliness makes older women surrender pieces of themselves too easily. I stopped wiping tables. Because suddenly I understood something painful. After Frank died, I became so focused on staying emotionally connected to family that I quietly stopped protecting my own independence. And everybody around me slowly adjusted to that smaller version of Evelyn. By the time I drove home, the sky had turned deep purple over the highway. I parked in my driveway and sat inside the car without moving for several minutes. The house looked quiet through the front windows. Too quiet sometimes. That loneliness tempted me constantly toward surrender. Cancel the trip, stay close to family, become easy, become manageable. But another part of me whispered something stronger now. If I gave up this piece of myself voluntarily, it might never come back. That night I opened my suitcase again. Then I added a second sweater, my good walking shoes, and the paperback novel I'd been saving for the train ride. Small actions, but deeply important ones. Because sometimes reclaiming your life begins with something as simple as refusing to unpack your suitcase. The first morning of my trip, I woke before sunrise inside a small historic inn in Charleston, listening to horse carriages move along wet cobblestone streets outside my window. And for the first time in years, nobody needed me. No medications to organize, no grocery lists, no reminder calls, no family schedules. Just silence. Beautiful silence. I sat near the window holding hotel coffee in both hands while early morning fog drifted slowly between old church steeples downtown. At 67 years old, that moment felt strangely unfamiliar. Not because I'd never been alone before, because I'd forgotten how to belong to myself. Back in Ohio, Daniel was discovering exactly how much invisible work I'd carried for decades. I didn't know most of it yet. Not until later. At the time, I was busy pretending I understood train schedules and trying not to look like a confused Midwestern widow studying tourist maps beside younger travelers. Charleston smelled like rainwater, sea salt, and old brick. I loved it immediately. Not in some dramatic movie way. Just quietly. Like recognizing a part of yourself you abandoned years ago. Meanwhile, back home, everything apparently started unraveling around Daniel by the second day. Melissa called me that afternoon while I sat outside a seafood restaurant overlooking the harbor. "You doing okay?" she asked. Interesting. Her tone sounded softer already. "I'm wonderful," I answered honestly. Long pause. Then I almost smiled into the phone. Nobody expected me to enjoy myself this much. That realization mattered. Melissa continued carefully. "Things are busy here." Translation: the invisible labor disappeared. I could practically hear stress inside her voice. Apparently, Chloe forgot her choir uniform. Daniel forgot to sign school paperwork. Nobody remembered to pick up Daniel's dry cleaning before his work presentation. Tiny things. But families run on tiny things handled consistently over decades. Most of those tiny things had quietly been me. After hanging up, I walked through Charleston's old market district, buying postcards I didn't need and pralines I definitely didn't need. And somewhere between those old brick buildings and harbor winds, I realized something painful. I had trained my family to expect endless emotional and practical support, while asking for almost nothing in return. That imbalance didn't happen overnight. It happened one sacrifice at a time. That evening, I joined a small walking tour through the historic district. The guide, a retired history teacher from Georgia, spoke about hurricanes' old Southern families and how cities survive by adapting without losing identity. That sentence followed me all night. Because maybe people worked the same way. Back in Ohio, Daniel stopped by my empty house the next afternoon to water my plants. At least that was the official reason. Really, I think he missed me. The house felt different without me there. Too still. He told me later the silence bothered him immediately. No television murmuring in the background, no smell of coffee, no casserole cooling on the stove. Just absence. While watering the plants, he accidentally opened the kitchen junk drawer searching for batteries. That's where he found old receipts, school photos, birthday cards, and folders labeled carefully in my handwriting. Inside one folder sat copies of checks. Hundreds of them. College tuition payments, emergency rent help after Daniel lost his first apartment, money quietly sent during rough years in his marriage. Daniel called me that night sounding strange. "Mom." I was sitting on the inn balcony wrapped in a blanket, watching rain fall softly into the courtyard garden. "What's wrong?" "You kept all those records." I looked out toward the wet Charleston street. "Yes." Long silence. "Then I forgot about half of it." That hurt him to admit. I could hear it. Not because he was ungrateful. Because adult children rarely understand the full architecture of sacrifice holding their lives together until much later. I never kept score, I said quietly. I know. But maybe part of me should have. Not financially. Emotionally. Families sometimes continue taking from women who never clearly teach where their limits are. The next day, Daniel visited my house again. This time intentionally. He later admitted he sat in Frank's old recliner for almost an hour just looking around the living room. That's when he noticed the travel brochure. The old one. Wrinkled from years inside a drawer. Yellowstone National Park Bus Tour 2004. Frank and I planned that trip 20 years earlier. Then Daniel lost his job that spring, and we used the money helping with his mortgage instead. I never mentioned regretting it. Because at the time I truly didn't. Daniel found notes scribbled inside the brochure in Frank's handwriting, places we wanted to visit, restaurants we planned to try, little jokes about retirement adventures. He called me again afterward. This time crying. Not loudly. Quietly. Like a man finally seeing his mother as a whole person instead of a permanent support system. I didn't know, he whispered. I closed my eyes. What didn't you know? How much you gave up. That sentence broke something open between us. Not magically. Not completely. But honestly, outside my balcony, Charleston rain continued falling softly across gas lamps and old sidewalks. And for the first time since retirement, I felt something unexpected. Not needed. Not useful. Just alive. By the time I came home from my trip, Ohio had turned fully into late autumn. Bare trees, cold sidewalks, gray skies hanging low over suburban rooftops. Daniel picked me up from the airport. That alone told me something had changed. Before the trip, he probably would have insisted I shouldn't travel alone. Now he simply carried my suitcase without commenting on the fact I'd managed perfectly fine. Small progress still counts. The ride home felt awkward at first. Not hostile. Just emotionally careful. Like two people walking across old ice. Daniel glanced at me a few times while driving through evening traffic. You look different, he finally said. I smiled slightly. I got some sleep. That made him laugh unexpectedly. Real laugh, not nervous laugh. And suddenly I saw my son again instead of the fearful middle-aged man trying to manage everybody's future. When we pulled into my driveway, he carried my suitcase inside and stopped in the living room looking around quietly. The house no longer felt tragic to him. Just lived in. That mattered. I cleaned out the gutters while you were gone, he said awkwardly. Thank you. And I fixed the porch light. I nodded. There it was again, help. But softer now, less controlling, more respectful. We stood there in silence for a moment before Daniel finally asked, Can we talk honestly? I almost smiled. After weeks of emotional collisions, that sentence sounded like progress. We ended up sitting on the back porch wearing jackets while cold wind moved through the maple tree behind the fence. Frank built that porch himself in 1994. Daniel learned how to use a hammer out there. Funny how families spend decades inside places without realizing how much memory wood can hold. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel said quietly, I was scared after Dad died. Not dramatic, not defensive. Just true. I folded my hands together slowly. I know. No, I mean really scared. The porch light cast soft shadows across his face while he stared out into the dark backyard. You stopped answering your phone sometimes, you forgot appointments, you stayed home too much. I nodded. All true. Grief rearranges people in strange, temporary ways. Daniel exhaled heavily. I kept thinking, what if something happens and nobody notices? That sentence softened something inside me immediately. Because beneath all the frustration and control, there it was. Fear of losing another parent. People rarely talk about how adulthood changes after your first parent dies. The surviving parent suddenly starts looking fragile even when they aren't. I understand that, I said gently. Daniel looked relieved for a second. Then I continued. But fear doesn't give you the right to decide my life for me. His shoulders dropped again. Fair. After a long silence, he admitted something else. Melissa's parents declining so fast really messed with us. Finally. The hidden layer underneath everything. Her father's stroke, her mother's dementia, the exhausting years of assisted living paperwork and medical emergencies. Daniel and Melissa weren't just reacting to my aging. They were reacting to trauma. That mattered. Not because it excused things. Because context matters in family wounds. I started thinking if we planned ahead early enough, Daniel said quietly, maybe we could avoid chaos later. I looked toward the dark maple branches moving in the wind. You weren't planning my future, I said softly. You were trying to manage your anxiety. Daniel nodded immediately. Exactly. That honesty changed everything. A few minutes later, Melissa arrived carrying a casserole dish. Of course she did. Midwestern women bring casseroles when emotional conversations become unavoidable. She looked nervous standing there in the porch light. I didn't know if you'd eaten. Interesting how apology sometimes arrives disguised as food. I invited her to sit down. For a while, the three of us just listened to distant traffic and the wind moving through dry leaves. Then Melissa finally spoke. I owe you an apology. No excuses afterward. Good start. She looked directly at me. My parents became dependent so quickly that I started treating aging like an emergency instead of a stage of life. That was probably the most emotionally intelligent thing she'd said since all this started. I projected a lot onto you, she admitted quietly. I appreciated that word projected. Not helped, not worried. Projected. Because fear makes people rewrite other people's identities sometimes. Melissa swallowed hard. When you booked that trip, I think part of me panicked. Why? Because you suddenly seemed independent again. There it was. The real thing underneath everything. Not fear that I'd fail. Fear that I might not need them the way they unconsciously expected. Families get emotionally comfortable when older relatives become predictable. Independence disrupts that. Daniel looked embarrassed suddenly. I really thought protecting you meant planning ahead. I turned toward him carefully. No, I said softly. Protecting someone means listening before deciding who they are. Silence followed that sentence. Heavy silence. Good silence. The kind families actually grow inside. Then Daniel said something I never expected. If you still want to travel next spring, maybe I could help you plan another trip. Not control it, not supervise it. Help. Real help this time. I smiled before I could stop myself. And for the first time in months, nobody in the conversation sounded afraid of my future. By the time I came home from my trip, Ohio had turned fully into late autumn. Bare trees, cold sidewalks, gray skies hanging low over suburban rooftops. Daniel picked me up from the airport. That alone told me something had changed. Before the trip, he probably would have insisted I shouldn't travel alone. Now he simply carried my suitcase without commenting on the fact I'd managed perfectly fine. Small progress still counts. The ride home felt awkward at first. Not hostile. Just emotionally careful. Like two people walking across old ice. Daniel glanced at me a few times while driving through evening traffic. You look different, he finally said. I smiled slightly. I got some sleep. That made him laugh unexpectedly. Real laugh, not nervous laugh. And suddenly I saw my son again instead of the fearful middle-aged man trying to manage everybody's future. When we pulled into my driveway, he carried my suitcase inside and stopped in the living room looking around quietly. The house no longer felt tragic to him. Just lived in. That mattered. I cleaned out the gutters while you were gone, he said awkwardly. Thank you. And I fixed the porch light. I nodded. There it was again, help. But softer now, less controlling, more respectful. We stood there in silence for a moment before Daniel finally asked, Can we talk honestly? I almost smiled. After weeks of emotional collisions, that sentence sounded like progress. We ended up sitting on the back porch wearing jackets while cold wind moved through the maple tree behind the fence. Frank built that porch himself in 1994. Daniel learned how to use a hammer out there. Funny how families spend decades inside places without realizing how much memory wood can hold. For a while, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel said quietly, I was scared after Dad died. Not dramatic, not defensive. Just true. I folded my hands together slowly. I know. No, I mean really scared. The porch light cast soft shadows across his face while he stared out into the dark backyard. You stopped answering your phone sometimes. You forgot appointments. You stayed home too much. I nodded. All true. Grief rearranges people in strange temporary ways. Daniel exhaled heavily. I kept thinking, what if something happens and nobody notices? That sentence softened something inside me immediately. Because beneath all the frustration and control there it was. Fear of losing another parent. People rarely talk about how adulthood changes after your first parent dies. The surviving parent suddenly starts looking fragile, even when they aren't. I understand that, I said gently. Daniel looked relieved for a second. Then I continued. But fear doesn't give you the right to decide my life for me. His shoulders dropped again. Fair. After a long silence, he admitted something else. Melissa's parents declining so fast really messed with us. Ah. Finally. The hidden layer underneath everything. Her father's stroke, her mother's dementia, the exhausting years of assisted living paperwork and medical emergencies. Daniel and Melissa weren't just reacting to my aging. They were reacting to trauma. That mattered. Not because it excused things. Because context matters in family wounds. I started thinking if we planned ahead early enough, Daniel said quietly, maybe we could avoid chaos later. I looked toward the dark maple branches moving in the wind. You weren't planning my future, I said softly. You were trying to manage your anxiety. Daniel nodded immediately. Exactly. That honesty changed everything. A few minutes later, Melissa arrived carrying a casserole dish. Of course she did. Midwestern women bring casseroles when emotional conversations become unavoidable. She looked nervous standing there in the porch light. I didn't know if you'd eaten. Interesting how apology sometimes arrives disguised as food. I invited her to sit down. For a while, the three of us just listened to distant traffic and the wind moving through dry leaves. Then Melissa finally spoke. I owe you an apology. No excuses afterward. Good start. She looked directly at me. My parents became dependent so quickly that I started treating aging like an emergency instead of a stage of life. That was probably the most emotionally intelligent thing she'd said since all this started. I projected a lot onto you, she admitted quietly. I appreciated that word, projected. Not helped, not worried. Projected. Because fear makes people rewrite other people's identities sometimes. Melissa swallowed hard. When you booked that trip, I think part of me panicked. Why? Because you suddenly seemed independent again. There it was. The real thing underneath everything. Not fear that I'd fail. Fear that I might not need them the way they unconsciously expected. Families get emotionally comfortable when older relatives become predictable. Independence disrupts that. Daniel looked embarrassed suddenly. I really thought protecting you meant planning ahead. I turned toward him carefully. No, I said softly. Protecting someone means listening before deciding who they are. Silence followed that sentence. Heavy silence. Good silence. The kind families actually grow inside. Then Daniel said something I never expected. If you still want to travel next spring, maybe I could help you plan another trip. Not control it, not supervise it. Help. Real help this time. I smiled before I could stop myself. And for the first time in months, nobody in the conversation sounded afraid of my future.